She had not heard his voice in over 3 decades, not since he was a little boy, torn from her life after a bitter divorce. Now, at 84, blind and living alone, she was listening to a television interview with a celebrated young tech CEO, and as he spoke, her world stopped. The polished voice of a billionaire stranger was the unmistakable sound of her lost grandson. For 35 years, Marion had believed he was lost to her forever, another casualty of a family fractured by divorce. Now, by chance, she had found him. He was no longer a missing child, but a powerful public figure, and she was a blind woman with only a memory of his voice and a telephone. The question was not just if she was right, but what would happen if she dared to call. Marion was 84. She lived alone in a small, rented apartment on a quiet street, her world defined by touch, memory, and the voices from her television. She had lost her sight to macular degeneration nearly a decade prior, a gradual dimming that left her with only light and shadow. Her days followed a gentle, predictable rhythm, a stark contrast to the tumultuous loss that had defined her past. 35 years ago, her only son David went through a bitter, scorched-earth divorce. His wife Evelyn was granted full custody of their 4-year-old boy Michael. The court order included a standard provision, but Evelyn weaponized it. She moved across the country, changed their last name, and severed all contact. David, crushed by the battle and his own failures, eventually stopped fighting. For Marion, the loss was a phantom limb that never stopped aching. She became one of the millions of grandparents statistically erased by divorce, a relationship severed at its most vulnerable point. She sent letters to old addresses that were never returned. She saved birthday cards in a drawer, each one a monument to a hope that faded with the years. As time passed, the sharp grief softened into a permanent, quiet sorrow. She assumed Michael had grown up with no memory of her, that she was a footnote in a story he had never been told. Meanwhile, the boy she remembered had become a man the world celebrated. Michael Vance, though that was not the name she knew, was the founder and CEO of Ether Dynamics, a Silicon Valley titan valued at over $12 billion. He was a staple of business media, a visionary who spoke in soundbites about disruption and the future. His childhood was a carefully crafted part of his origin myth, a tale of humble, single-parent resilience that omitted entire branches of his family tree. On that ordinary afternoon, a financial news channel was airing a pre-recorded interview. Marion was listening as she knitted, the commentator's questions a familiar background hum. Then Michael began to speak about risk. There was a particular lilt at the end of his sentences, a slight, unconscious hesitation before a hard C sound. It was an echo, a sonic fingerprint unchanged by decades or fortune. Her hands stilled. The wool slipped into her lap. A memory vivid and tactile erupted, not an image but a feeling, a small warm weight on her lap on a porch swing, the smell of cut grass. She was telling a story, a little boy's voice giggling, asking why, with that same telltale lift. The memory was so sharp it stole her breath. It was him. Logic screamed it was impossible, a coincidence, a trick of a lonely mind. But in the realm of sense and memory, where she now lived, there was no doubt. The voice of the billionaire was the voice of her grandson. Panic, electric and cold, followed the certainty. What did she do with this? He existed in a galaxy of wealth and influence. She was an old woman in a dark, quiet room. To claim him was absurd. To remain silent was a betrayal of a bond she had never willingly broken. The statistics she unknowingly represented, that 6% of grandparents are estranged from their grandchildren, suddenly had a face, a name, and a voice on her television. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She fumbled for the telephone, the old rotary model she could dial by touch. Her finger hovered over the receiver. To call the television station was to invite disbelief, to risk humiliation. They would think she was a confused old woman, another desperate soul imagining a connection to fame. But the alternative was to let the moment pass, to allow the silence to stretch for another 35 years until it was permanent. With a trembling hand, she pulled the business card she kept for her doctor from a bowl by the phone. She did not need to see it. She needed the gesture, the routine of seeking help. She dialed the long-distance information number, her voice surprisingly steady when the operator answered. "I need the number for the news station, for Global Business Daily in New York City, please." The operator provided it. Marion recited the number aloud, committing it to memory, the digits falling into a familiar mental pattern. She hung up. The room was silent save for the low murmur of the television, now discussing market forecasts. The interview was over. His voice was gone. She sat in the deepening twilight for a long time, the phone a cold weight in her lap. This was the precipice. On one side was the safe, known ache of absence. On the other was a leap into a world that had forgotten her, armed with nothing but a ghost of a sound and a love that had outlasted every rational reason to exist. She picked up the receiver again. The dial tone was a loud, demanding hum in the quiet apartment. She brought her finger to the rotary dial, positioned it on the first digit. This call would set in motion forces she could not control. It would reach the front desk of a major network, then a producer's office, then a publicist, and finally, perhaps, a man who had built an empire on a foundation of a forgotten past. He had no idea she existed, and he was seconds away from finding out. The phone rang for a long time in New York before a brisk, automated voice answered, listing options in a sterile digital cadence. Press 1 for general inquiries. Press 2 for advertising. Marion, her finger tracing the raised dots on the rotary dial, waited for the prompt to end. She pressed 0 again and again until a live human voice, laced with impatience, came on the line. Global Business Daily, how can I direct your call? I need to speak with someone about an interview that aired today, Marion said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. With Michael Vance. The receptionist transferred her to a general mailbox for viewer comments. Marion left a message, concise and clear. My name is Marion Ellis. The man you interviewed today, Michael Vance, is my grandson. I have not seen him since he was 4 years old. Please, I need someone to listen. Please tell him his grandmother is looking for him. She left her number and hung up, her entire body shaking. In the labyrinth of a major news network, her message was a pebble dropped into an ocean. It landed in a shared digital queue, one of hundreds marked for low priority review by a junior production assistant named Chloe. It was late on a Friday. Chloe was skimming messages, filtering out obvious spam and conspiracy rants. She heard the clear, elderly voice, the specific claim. Most she would have deleted, but two things gave her pause. The woman sounded utterly lucid. And she wasn't asking for money, she was asking for a connection. Curiosity, a journalist's flicker, made Chloe note the name and number. She ran a quick internal search. Michael Vance's pre-interview background brief mentioned a mother, a school teacher, raised in Oregon, no father, certainly no living grandmother, standard orphan to tycoon narrative. It checked out, yet the conviction in that recorded voice lingered. As a procedural step, she forwarded the message and her note to the segment producer, Mark, and to the mailbox of Vance's corporate communications office at Ether Dynamics. She labeled it, Viewer claim, possible familial relation, unlikely but persistent. Her workday ended. She forgot about it. At Ether Dynamics, the communication was intercepted by a layer of security and reputation management software. Keywords like grandmother, family, and claim triggered a standard protocol. The message was routed to a junior member of the external communications team, who saw it as a potential phishing attempt or the opening move of a bizarre extortion plot. He drafted a polite, automated-seeming reply denying the claim and discouraging further contact, then archived the ticket. The system had done its job. It had shielded the CEO. But the producer, Mark, was a different story. He was a veteran, weary of slick PR narratives. He remembered the Vance pre-interview. The man had been oddly evasive about childhood specifics, deflecting with practiced, inspirational vagueness. The grandmother's message was a tiny crack in that polished facade. He didn't believe it, but he smelled a story. Not a reunion story, a fraud story, or a tragedy story. He called a private contact, a researcher, and asked for a discreet, superficial look into Marion Ellis. The report came back in 24 hours. Marion Ellis, 84, widowed, legally blind. Modest apartment, no criminal record, no history of mental illness filings. One son, David Ellis, deceased 7 years prior. David Ellis had a divorce record from 35 years ago from an Evelyn Reed. A son was listed on the decree, Michael Reed, age 4. The researcher noted the name change. The child's surname was changed to Vance 2 years after the divorce, per a court order filed by the mother. Mark sat at his desk, the hum of the newsroom fadding around him. The dates aligned. The names connected. This wasn't a fantasy, it was a paper trail. The billionaire's origin story was a lie by omission. He had a grandmother alive who had been systematically removed from his life. This was no longer a human interest footnote. It was a legitimate news piece about identity, family secrets, and the narratives we build to survive. He called Marion back. His tone was no longer that of a gatekeeper, but of an investigator. "Mrs. Ellis, this is Mark from Global Business Daily. I received your message. I need to ask you some very specific questions." Across the country, Marion held the phone, a lifeline suddenly thrumming with current. She answered everything: dates, addresses, the color of the porch swing, the song she used to sing. She described the small scar above Michael's left eyebrow from a tumble off a tricycle. She described his father's laugh. With each detail, Mark's professional skepticism eroded. This was real. "Mrs. Ellis," he said finally, his voice low, "I believe you, but you need to understand what you're starting. This will upend his public story. There will be legal teams, public relations spin. He may not be receptive. Are you prepared for that?" Marion was silent for a moment. "I have been prepared for 35 years of silence," she said. "A few weeks of noise is nothing. I just need him to know I'm here." Mark made a decision. He would not yet run a story. The ethical move was to facilitate contact, if possible. He drafted a new, highly confidential email to Michael Vance's most senior and trusted executive assistant, a woman named Sophia, whose name he had gotten from a source. He attached the researcher's summary and Marion's contact information. The subject line was urgent and personal regarding Marion Ellis. The body was 3 sentences. "This woman's claim is substantiated by public records. She is seeking contact only. I am holding the story pending your response." This email, unlike the first, bypassed the corporate filters. It landed in Sophia's primary inbox. She had been with Michael for 8 years. She knew every contour of his curated life. She opened it, read it once, then again, her blood running cold. This wasn't an attack. It was a seismic event. She walked directly into his office, closing the soundproof door behind her. Michael Vance was mid-stride, packing as he dictated a memo on quantum computing investments. He was 40, but energy and ambition made him seem younger. "Sophia, I need those figures by 4, he said without looking up. "Michael," she said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet, "you need to see this, now." She handed him a tablet with the email displayed. He took it, his eyes scanning. For a full minute he said nothing. The confident CEO vanished. The man who stood there was pale, his expression blank, as if his operating system had crashed. He read the name, Marion Ellis. A flood of sense memory, not narrative, overwhelmed him. The smell of lavender, the feeling of thick, soft yarn, a voice singing something about a mockingbird. They were fragments, disconnected from story, anchored deep in a primal part of his brain he never accessed. "This is a scam," he finally whispered, the words hollow. "The producer included records, Michael. Your parents' divorce decree, your birth name, it's real." He stumbled to his chair, the weight of the revelation physical. His origin story, the bedrock of his public identity, the struggling single mother, the absent father, was true, but it was incomplete. It had a prologue, a grandmother, a whole lineage on his father's side erased. His mother, Evelyn, had told him his father's family wanted nothing to do with them. She had said they were cruel, disapproving. She had been the gatekeeper, and she had closed the gate forever. Anger, hot and sudden, surged first. At his mother for the lie, at this old woman for shattering the myth he'd lived inside, at the journalist for digging. Then a colder, more terrifying feeling, grief, for a relationship he never knew was missing, for a grandfather he'd never met, for a father he'd been taught to resent, who was now just a ghost in a legal document. "What do I do?" he asked, not his assistant but the room. Sophia, ever practical, saw the crisis on 2 fronts, the personal and the corporate. "You need to verify this yourself, beyond a reporter's file, discreetly, and we need a communications strategy. If this gets out, it reframes everything. Billionaire discovers estranged family is a headline that can swing many ways." He nodded, the CEO reasserting control. "Get me everything, her medical records, financials, every public trace, and get my mother on the phone, tonight." His voice was steel, but his hands trembled slightly. The investigation into Marion, now funded by billionaire resources, was swift and thorough. It confirmed everything. It also painted a picture of a gentle, isolated life. No demands, no history of trouble, just silence, and then one phone call. The call with his mother, Evelyn, was a disaster. He confronted her with the name. There was a long, static-filled silence from her home in Portland, then not denial, but a fierce, defensive justification. They were toxic, Michael. Your father was weak. His mother was overbearing. They would have ruined you, held you back. I protected you. I gave you the clean slate you needed to become who you are. He listened, hearing not protection, but possession. The gatekeeper had not been shielding him from harm, but guarding her own narrative, her own pain. She had made a unilateral decision for decades, severing a bond that wasn't hers to sever. The statistics had a face now, and it was his mother. Back in her apartment, Marion waited. Days passed. The call from the producer had been a spark, but now there was only silence again, deeper and more profound than before. She had been verified, assessed, and was now being deliberated upon by a board of one. The hope, once a fragile bud, began to wither under the strain of corporate scrutiny. Then, on the fifth evening, her phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. She answered, her heart in her throat. Mrs. Ellis, it was a woman's voice, polite, professional. This is Sophia, calling on behalf of Michael Vance. He has received your message. He would like to arrange a conversation. The relief was so immense it was dizzying. Yes, Marion breathed. Yes, of course, when? He is preparing to leave for a conference in Europe tomorrow, but he can spare a few minutes tonight. Would 9 o'clock your time be acceptable? He will call this number. Marion agreed, the words barely audible. She hung up and sat perfectly still in the dark room. He was going to call. In 3 hours, she would hear his voice again, this time speaking to her. The decades of absence collapsed into the agonizing sweep of the minute hand on a clock she could not see. At 8:55, she sat by the phone, her hand resting on the receiver. She had rehearsed nothing. What did you say to a ghost who had become a king? The phone remained silent. 9:05, then 10 past. The tight coil of anticipation began to twist into the old, familiar ache of disappointment. He had changed his mind. The gate, even when found, remained locked. At 9:17, the phone rang, a jarring scream in the quiet. She snatched it up. Hello. There was a pause, a beat of dead air filled with the faint sound of breathing. Then a voice, the same one from the television, but stripped of its polished, public cadence. It was hesitant, raw, and unbearably young. Grandmother. The word, unspoken for 35 years, hung between them. Marion's throat closed. All she could manage was a soft, broken whisper. Michael. And in that single, shared word, the first domino fell. But the call was not an ending. It was a detonation. For Michael, speaking the word made it real, and the reality was a vortex of emotional and legal chaos. For Evelyn, monitoring her son's world from afar, the breach of her fortress had been detected. And for Marion, the simple act of answering had unknowingly pulled her into the center of a billion-dollar storm, where family secrets were liabilities and love was the most disruptive force of all. The silence on the phone line was not empty. It was full of 35 years of lost birthdays, of Christmases, of every question he had never asked. He could hear her soft breathing, the faint rustle of her sweater. The CEO, the negotiator, the visionary, had no script for this. Michael began, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Michael, Marion replied, her own voice thick with tears. Just hearing you is enough. But it wasn't enough. For him, it was the beginning of an unraveling. They spoke for 20 minutes. He learned his grandfather had died a decade ago, a fact that landed with a surprising, sharp grief. He learned his father had passed away 7 years back, a man he remembered only as a vague, angry shadow from his mother's stories, now revealed as a broken son himself, cut off from his own parents. With every sentence from Marion, the myth of his lonely, self-made ascent crumbled a little more. He had not emerged from a vacuum. He was the product of a fractured line, a survivor of a silent war he never knew was fought over him. When the call ended, a profound exhaustion settled over him, deeper than any all-nighter at the office. He cancelled his trip to Europe. The conference was a triviality. He had a more pressing merger to negotiate, the merger of his two identities. Sophia, watching from the doorway, saw the change immediately. The driven intensity was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out contemplation. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need to see her," he said quietly. "Before anything else happens, before the world gets hold of this, just see her." Sophia nodded. She arranged a private jet to Marion's regional airport for the following evening. The plan was simple, total secrecy. No security detail, no assistants, just him. He would use an assumed name, wear a cap, travel like a ghost to the life he'd left behind. But secrets in the digital age are fragile. Evelyn, his mother, had been monitoring his company's flight manifests through a contact in aviation logistics, a paranoid habit she'd developed after he became famous. When she saw the private plane scheduled for a small, obscure city, Marion's City, with his name listed under a vague corporate entity, she knew the breach had become an invasion. She called him not with tears this time, but with cold, legal fury. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Michael. That woman and her son, your father, they sued for visitation after the divorce. They harassed us. I have the court papers. They wanted to take you away from me. I didn't erase them to be cruel. I did it to protect you. And now you're walking right back into their hands." He demanded to see the papers. She emailed them. They were real. A motion from his father, David Ellis, petitioning for visitation rights. It was denied, labeled frivolous by the court. His grandmother was listed as a co-petitioner, described as seeking excessive access. The narrative flipped again. Was Marion not a passive victim, but an aggressor? Had his mother's actions, however extreme, been a justified defense? He confronted Marion on a second, strained call. "My mother showed me court documents. You and my father tried to sue for custody." There was a long pause on Marion's end. When she spoke, her voice was weary with ancient pain. "We sued for visitation, Michael. 1 weekend a month, that's all, not custody. Your mother said we were a bad influence. She said your father was unstable. The judge believed the mother. It was 1988, that's how it was." She took a shaky breath. "We sent letters after that to you care of her. We called on your birthday. For years, the letters came back. The number was disconnected. We weren't trying to take you. We were just trying to love you from a distance we didn't choose." The truth, as it often does, lay in the gray space between two black and white stories. His mother had defended her territory. His grandmother had tried, legally and then futilely, to hold on. He was the territory, the prize, the lost child. The weight of being fought over, even in silence, was immense. He decided to go anyway. He needed to look into the eyes of the past, whatever they held. The meeting was arranged for Marion's apartment. He stood outside her door, a billionaire feeling like a nervous boy. He knocked. The door opened. She stood there, one hand on the frame, her clouded eyes not quite meeting his. She was smaller than he'd imagined, fragile in a knitted cardigan. She smiled, a tentative, hopeful thing. "Michael." "Yes," he said, his throat tight. She reached out a hand, not to shake, but to find him. He took it, getting her fingers to his face. Her touch was soft, papery. She traced his brow, his nose, his jawline, her expression one of intense, blind concentration. She touched the small, faint scar above his left eyebrow. A tear escaped her clouded eye and traced a path through her wrinkles. "It's you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My boy." In that modest, dim living room, the public persona of Michael Vance dissolved. He was just a man, found by a woman who loved him before he knew what love was. He helped her to her couch. She made tea, moving by memory, her hands sure on the familiar kettle and cups. They talked. He told her about his work, his life in simple terms, not as a CEO, but as a person. She told him stories about his father as a child, stories that painted a picture of a sensitive boy, not the monster his mother had described. It was a reconciliation of memory, a stitching together of a torn tapestry. But as they spoke, a storm was gathering. Evelyn, realizing her legal warnings had failed, activated a different plan. She called Mark, the news producer. Her tone was not that of a victim, but a source. "You're sitting on a story about a family reunion. That's the feel-good angle. Would you like the real story? The story of harassment, of a grandmother who was denied access by the courts for the child's own good. I have documentation." I'll give you an exclusive interview. My son is being emotionally manipulated by a stranger and his own guilt." For Mark, this was the twist. The simple reunion narrative was now a complex, bitter family feud with two sides. He had a duty to present both. He told Evelyn he would consider her interview, but he needed to verify her claims. The story was no longer a private matter, it was a public juggernaut, and he had his hand on the lever. Meanwhile, in the corporate world, whispers began. Michael's abrupt cancellation of high-stakes meetings, his secretive travel under an alias, these were anomalies that his rivals and investors noticed. A hedge fund analyst with a knack for gossip dug deeper, cross-referencing flight data with property records. He found Marion Ellis. He found the old divorce. He pieced together a shocking theory. Michael Vance had a hidden family scandal. In the high-stakes market, perception is everything. A CEO seen as emotionally compromised, distracted by a personal crisis, is a CEO whose leadership is questioned. The analyst published a brief, speculative note on an influential financial blog. It didn't name Marion, but it asked, "Is Ether's visionary captain steering through a personal storm?" The phrase "personal storm" was a flare. It was enough. Sophia's phone began to buzz incessantly, emails from the board, texts from investors. The carefully contained situation was leaking. She interrupted Michael's visit with an urgent call. "Michael, you need to come back. Now it's not private anymore. There's speculation. The board is getting nervous." He looked at Marion, sitting peacefully on her sofa, unaware of the hurricane forming around her simple wish to know her grandson. He felt a surge of protective anger. He would not let her become a headline, a scandal. He would not let his mother control the narrative again. "I'm not leaving," he told Sophia, his voice low and decisive. "I'm staying right here, and we're going to get ahead of this. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning." Sophia was stunned. A press conference to say what? "The truth," Michael said, looking at his grandmother's serene, blind face. "My truth, before anyone else can tell it for me." He was choosing his grandmother's quiet living room over his glass-walled boardroom. He was choosing the difficult, messy truth over the clean, marketable lie. It was the most irrational business decision he had ever made, and the only one that felt right. But in choosing to protect her, he was about to ignite the very fire he feared, exposing both of them to a glare far harsher than the dim light of her apartment. The private family crack had just become a public fault line, and the ground was beginning to shake. The press conference was not held in a sleek corporate auditorium, but on the modest, tree-lined sidewalk outside Marion Ellis's apartment building. Michael stood without a podium, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to his usual tailored silhouette. Satellite trucks crowded the narrow street, reporters jostled on the lawn. The world was watching, expecting a corporate statement, a denial, a carefully lawyered deflection. He began not with a business update, but with a story. 35 years ago, he said, his voice clear and carrying in the morning air, a little boy lost his grandmother, not through death, but through divorce, distance, and decisions made by adults in a war he didn't understand. I was that boy. For my entire public life, I have told a story of solitary origin. That story was incomplete. It was a story that protected some and erased others. Today, I am erasing that story. He laid it out with the clarity of a boardroom presentation, but the content was pure, raw humanity. The divorce, the name change, the legal battle for visitation that failed, the letters returned, the systematic silencing of one side of his family. He did not vilify his mother, but he did not spare the truth. He spoke of Evelyn's fear, her protective fury. He spoke of his father's failure and his grandmother's long, quiet vigil. And then he turned slightly, extending a hand toward the front door of the building. Marion, guided by Sophia, stepped out. She wore her best dress, her white hair in a neat bun. She blinked in the daylight she could not see, her hand finding Michael's arm. The camera's whirred, a cacophony of clicks and shutters. She did not flinch. "This is Marion Ellis," Michael said, his voice softening. "My grandmother. She found me not with detectives or demands, but by listening. She heard my voice on a television and remembered the boy I was. She asked for nothing but the chance to tell me she remembered. I am here today to tell her and to tell all of you that I remember now too." He took no questions. He simply turned, wrapped a protective arm around Marion, and led her back inside, leaving a stunned media scrum in his wake. The act was breathtaking in its audacity. A billionaire CEO had just voluntarily detonated his own origin myth on a suburban sidewalk for an audience of one blind woman. The fallout was immediate and seismic. The financial blog speculation exploded into front-page news across every business and tabloid outlet. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's secret family" and "CEO's emotional confession." His mother, Evelyn, watched from Portland, her face ashen. Her planned interview with Mark, meant to control the narrative, was now obsolete. Michael had taken the story from her, and he had told it with a mercy she had not shown. The stock of Ether Dynamics dipped, then tumbled as old guard investors expressed concerns over leadership stability. Talking heads debated whether his emotional transparency was a strength or a fatal distraction, but a different analysis also emerged. Younger investors, consumers saw something new, a leader willing to be vulnerable to correct a historic wrong. Brand sentiment analysis, which Sophia monitored obsessively, showed a surprising surge in positive association. The human story, messy and real, was resonating. Inside the apartment, away from the chaos, Michael and Marion sat at her small kitchen table. "I'm sorry," he said. "I brought the storm to your doorstep." Marion reached across the table, her hand finding his. "I have lived through 35 years of quiet, Michael. A little noise for a little while is a fair trade for this." The phone rang. It was Evelyn. Michael hesitated, then answered on speaker. "You humiliated me." Evelyn's voice was brittle, stripped of its earlier fury, hollowed out by defeat. "I told the truth, Mom," he said quietly. "A truth you kept from me. I'm not choosing her over you. I'm choosing to stop living in a story where I have to choose at all." There was a long silence, then a sound they had never heard from her, a quiet, broken sob. "I was so afraid of losing you," she whispered. "I thought if they had any piece of you, they would take you away. I built a wall. I didn't know it would become a prison for all of us." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first crack of light, an acknowledgement of pain rather than a weaponization of it. Michael told her he loved her, that they would find a way through, and hung up. The legal and corporate maneuvering continued for weeks. Michael's board called for a vote of confidence. He won it, but narrowly. The hedge fund analyst who broke the initial story published a follow-up titled The Integrity Premium, arguing that Michael's actions, while unorthodox, demonstrated a foundational integrity that was ultimately good for long-term governance. The stock began a slow, steady recovery. But Michael's focus had irrevocably shifted. He established a family foundation, not in his name, but in the names of David and Marion Ellis. Its first initiative was funding legal aid and mediation services for families navigating grandparent estrangement after divorce, directly addressing the systemic gatekeeping he had experienced. And then he did the thing that no spreadsheet could justify. He bought the small, tidy cottage 2 houses down from Marion's apartment. He didn't move her to a gated estate or a penthouse. He moved into her world. He hired a live-in aide, not just for care, but for companionship when he was traveling. He had her kitchen modernized for safety, her bathroom fitted with supports, all done quietly, with her input at every step. One evening, a month after the press conference, he sat with her on her porch swing, a new one he'd had installed, wide and comfortable. The street was quiet. He was reading the business section aloud to her. She interrupted him, her hand on his arm. "Michael, do you remember the song, On the Old Swing?" He thought hard, sifting through the fragmented memories her presence was reviving. A tune, a nonsense rhyme about a blue jay. He hummed a few notes, uncertain. Her face lit up. "That's it," she said, her clouded eyes crinkling at the corners. "You remember." And in that moment, he realized the final, surprising detail of the entire ordeal. The reunion was not about him giving her a new life of luxury. It was about her giving him back his old one, the pieces of his history, his identity that he never knew were missing. The billionaire had spent his life acquiring things, but the most valuable thing he now possessed was a memory of a song on a porch swing, returned to him by a blind woman who never let go of it. The public story had reached its conclusion. The CEO, the grandmother, the reconciliation. But the private story, the real one, was just beginning. It would be found in quiet evenings on a porch, in shared meals, in the slow, patient work of knitting a family back together across a chasm of decades. Michael had learned that the most disruptive technology wasn't in his labs. It was love, a force that could crash through firewalls of silence and rewrite the most deeply ingrained code of a life. He had climbed the mountain of success alone, believing the summit was everything. But the real reward was the discovery of the base camp he had abandoned, still there, waiting with a song and a steady, patient heart. The journey down was just as important as the climb up. In the end, this story is not about a billionaire or a scandal or a media circus. It is about a much quieter, more profound phenomenon. It is about the tenacity of memory and the way love can echo across a lifetime, waiting for a single point of recognition to make itself known again. Marian Ellis, with a world reduced to shadows and sounds, could see what others, with perfect vision, could not. She saw through the persona to the person. She recognized a fragment of a soul in the cadence of a voice. This forces us to ask a difficult question. In our own lives, how many connections have we failed to recognize because we were only looking with our eyes and not listening with our memories? How many people have we placed into neat, categorical boxes, estranged, lost, gone, when a thread, however fine, still tethers them to us? The statistics tell us estrangement is common, affecting millions. But statistics are the map, not the territory. The territory is the empty chair at a table, the unsent birthday card, the ghost of a voice in a quiet room. Michael Vance's journey shows that reconciliation is not a return to a past that never was. It is the courageous creation of a new present, built on the uncomfortable, glorious rubble of the truth. We live in an age of curated identities, of personal brands and selective histories. We are encouraged to edit our pasts into clean, motivational narratives. But this story is a testament to the power of the unedited version. The broken parts, the silent chapters, the missing people, they are not flaws in the narrative. They are the narrative. Our wholeness often depends on reclaiming the pieces we, or others, discarded. So what is the lesson here? Perhaps it is simply this: pay attention to the echoes. The past is not dead. It is a silent frequency, broadcasting on a channel we have simply stopped tuning into. A song, a scent, a turn of phrase, the sound of a voice through a television speaker. These can be keys to rooms we thought were sealed forever. Marian and Michael's story is a specific miracle, but the hope it offers is universal. It suggests that no bond is truly broken until all parties stop listening for the echo. It argues for the possibility of grace in a world that often feels ruthlessly linear. Their reunion was not an ending, but a new beginning, a reminder that it is never too late to answer a call you didn't know was still connected. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a thread in your own life that feels frayed or forgotten, consider this your sign. The first step is not a grand gesture. It is a whisper. It is a memory. It is the decision to listen. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. If you want to see more stories that explore the profound connections that define us, please subscribe and tap the bell for notifications. We'll see you next time.